Good evening. My name is Rich Schrager. I'm a law professor at the University of Virginia School of Law, and welcome to the Miller Center, our event on federalism in the age of COVID-19. We're really excited to have you here. It may be one of our last events, or one leading to the last events where we're not in person. One of the advantages of the Zoom and this pandemic has been that we get to bring great people in from outside, from far away, and we have two great guests today to talk about this topic. Let me introduce them and then talk a little bit about what this subject is, and remind all the audience that we want to take your questions. If you want to submit a question, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom link and just type them in, and we will try to get to them. I will try to read them and get to them as we can. But first, we're going to have a conversation. Let me introduce our panelists. Miriam Seifter is a professor of law at the University of Wisconsin School of Law. She is a former clerk to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Judge Merrick Garland. She has degrees from Yale, Harvard, and Oxford. She writes incredible stuff about states, particularly about states and state government. One thing I have on my desk today is an article called The Counter-Majoritarian Legislatures, which is just excellent work. Thank you, Miriam, for being with us. I think she's in New Zealand these days, so coming from far away. But we appreciate you coming to share your expertise with us. Jonathan Rodden is a political science professor at Stanford. I also am a big fan of his. He's written a number of books, many of which are on my shelf behind me, including most recently a book called Why Cities Lose: The Deep Roots of the Urban-Rural Political Divide. He does a lot of work on fiscal federalism and other issues. The book is terrific, and I encourage you all to take a look at it. I'm certainly spending some time with it these days. So we hope to have a little bit of a conversation, and again, as I said, to invite your questions. I want to start just by framing the issue, which is both an issue that we're looking back on and looking forward in a way, which is how did the system of government in the United States, in particular the division of authority between local, state, and national actors, how did that division of authority fare in this past year and a half or so of the pandemic? Did federalism, in other words, respond appropriately to this national and global emergency, or did it show and reveal some deep flaws? And what can we say, in fact, going forward in the face of, say, future global emergencies like this one, or the future of American politics and the structure of government in the United States in addressing other kinds of issues, for example, like the urban-rural divide? So that's the question on the table. And I wanted to start just by putting that question to Miriam and Jonathan. And the question is the one that I've just stated, which is, how did the United States do? How did the initial and ongoing U.S. response to the pandemic, and obviously it's continuing, we're in the vaccination stage. What did that response, the initial response and now the ongoing response, tell us or reveal about the state of U.S. style federalism these days, and how we're doing? And maybe we'll talk a little bit about how we think it has affected that going forward. But what's your assessment? We'll start with Miriam first.
Yeah, so first, thank you for having me, Rich, and thanks to all who organized this, and thanks to all of you for being here today. To your question, I think that federalism both helped us and hurt us, and it did so in ways that both mirror well-documented features and bugs of federalist systems, but that also might highlight a distinctive moment in American federalism and its intersection with polarization. But I'll just cover that first part, which is how the pandemic well illustrated what we might call federalism's greatest hits, some of the classic advantages and drawbacks that are associated with a system like this. And let me start on the advantages side, which might be getting sort of less attention right now. So one advantage of federalism is that it provides a safeguard against either tyrannical figures at the national level or big mistakes at the national level. And the idea is it's better to have some semi-autonomous entities than to have, say, incompetence all the way down. And that safeguard benefit was on display with the pandemic. When the federal government was doing nothing, it was better to have states that were doing something. Not as good, perhaps, as national excellence, but better than universal inaction. The second benefit of a federalist system is that it allows for local tailoring or differentiation, at least on topics where that's appropriate. And that sort of local tailoring idea feeds a literature that's full of other good things that can come from that, like localized expertise, policies that honor community-specific values, and so on. And here, there is some space for that in pandemic response as well. Not on every topic, but it might be the case that with things like vaccine distribution, there's benefit in, say, taking those vaccines to places where people trust the provider, prioritizing based on local geography or local need, and that kind of thing. But that brings me to the disadvantages, which is maybe what's gotten more attention. So first, people often say that federalism can be problematic because it can lead to fragmentation and collective action problems. And that was a big problem, especially in the early days of the pandemic, as I think was really well publicized. It was unproductive, for example, to have states competing against each other for PPE. And there were some matters that are just sort of not within states' purview, right? Like it's not for any individual state to make decisions about how the nation will deal with arrivals at international airports. So we saw, I think, a lot of shortcomings related to those fragmentation and collective action problems. And the last thing I'll say on the disadvantages side is, federalism has long been associated with the risk of unacceptable standards or outcomes if states are free to choose for themselves, if the federal government is not providing a minimum standard or a floor. Obviously, federalism's association with racial oppression is the most well-known example of this idea that states might make unacceptable choices. Shifting to the context of the pandemic, you might say that there are some gray areas in a pandemic playbook, but there are some right and wrong answers, and a lack of federal leadership gave states room to choose wrong answers at times when right answers were vital. So as to both of those downsides, I do think there's widespread belief that they were partly avoidable. Like federalism could have operated better with earlier national leadership on the matters that only the national government could do well. That's not incompatible with federalism, though. That's entirely compatible with a federalist system to have that important national leadership. But I would say overall, those are sort of the familiar pros and cons of federalism that we saw illustrated. And I'll leave it to Jonathan to talk about sort of where we are with polarization.
Yeah, so Jonathan, Miriam sort of laid it out actually fairly neutrally, I feel like. Do you have stronger views on this or similar ones?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thanks for putting this together. And I just want to say that if the hope was that by putting us together, you would create a great deal of controversy and we would be disagreeing with each other a lot, you'll be very disappointed. And I also really try to view this as neutrally as possible. And I think so. I think we're both going to give you this answer that is not super exciting. That there are costs and benefits, and that there are some, so there's evidence of some of the features of American federalism that lots of people like, not just Americans, but that people around the world look to American federalism as a kind of as something that's high functioning. And then clearly there was a moment in the pandemic when everyone was looking at American federalism as incredibly dysfunctional, and for good reason. And so I think it's if we think about this, these are not easy decisions for like how to deal with an emerging pandemic where the best practices are really kind of unknown and emerging and evolving. And the thing we want from our leaders is to take in that information and digest it and act quickly upon this. And the science is a moving target here as well. And so the things that we want from government are, I think it's clear that we didn't get some of it in the U.S. and it was especially at the federal level, the initial response was, I don't think it's too controversial to claim that it was lacking. And so in that kind of setting, it is, I think, comforting, as Miriam was pointing out, to have a multi-layered system where, if you think about it as a difficult set of decisions where there's a trade-off at play between rights and public health, or between economics and public health, that different, if we think about it as just different groups in society are going to think about that trade-off in different ways. If the federal government is making a decision, or making, it has an approach to that trade-off that is really highlighting rights over public health, and there are other groups that are geographically arranged in space, in states and cities, that have a very different idea about that trade-off. It is comforting to have a multi-layered system where they can implement policies that really promote public health and make a different trade-off. And rather than just having a one-size-fits-all policy. But at the same time, there's just clearly also there's just so many costs associated with the fragmentation, the fight over PPE and so forth that Miriam referred to. I would also even say within states, just looking at metropolitan areas in which counties were free to make their own decisions about shutdowns and mandates and so forth. The idea of having within a metro area, having all the bars open on one side of a county boundary and all of them closed on the other side, so everybody who wants a drink just goes to a different bar. I mean, if you're a bar owner on the side of the boundary where they're closed, it all starts to seem irrational. And it's been so much written about the need for coordination and for some kind of, especially within a metropolitan area, within a state, for some kind of a common approach, or it's just hopeless. So it's just clear that there's a kind of a problem associated with fragmentation and decentralization that can be solved with good leadership. But it's that danger, I think, was very much on display. But just kind of the broader answer, just for in thinking about federalism and thinking about American federalism, it'd be nice to know how other decentralized countries, if we think that if all the problems I just described are kind of pretty standard problems that we might imagine would have showed up in Germany and Spain or Australia, for that matter, a place that also has a federal system with a lot of public health autonomy for the states and had a very different kind of outcome. And so if we just look at federalism or measures of decentralization, we try to correlate those with deaths or excess mortality, which I think is a fraught exercise that we can just, but it really is nothing there. It doesn't really appear that there is a special problem with federalism or decentralization in general. So what is it that worked especially badly in the US? And the more I think about that, the more I come around to the idea that it's polarization that really makes, that it's this kind of, it was a toxic combination of federalism and decentralization with political polarization, a kind of this kind of negative, this kind of negative partisanship that has come to take hold in the United States. And so I think when we look at how states and municipalities dealt with the virus and how they argued with one another and all the things that we're going to talk about today, I think it's in my mind that in the US case, to understand some of the failures, we really need to understand the nature of that polarization.
Yeah, which I think, so you raise an interesting question, which is, are we going to see the federal system matters at all? It may not be doing the work, right? And I expect on the political science side of things, there will be these cross-national studies that you're suggesting. Some graduate students will run some regressions and find out, well, some federal systems did okay and some did not. It's maybe not attributable to that. But it was so apparent in the United States, both in terms of the conflicts between the national government and the states and the local governments, and as between states, with some closing their borders, some not. Jonathan, you mentioned the open bars on one side, the closed bars on the other side. So from many people's perspective, all of that stuff just led to this I think sense of chaos, right? It's a kind of a sense that nothing here is being run from the top. And that leads me to this my second question. I think we should get to polarization soon, but my second question is, so the federal government absence, I've heard both of you say, federal government absence itself from making national COVID policy, and it left it to the states. How did the states do? I mean, Miriam, you've mentioned that, well, the benefit of having the states at all is they can do something slightly different than the federal government, or very different from the federal government. How would you assess the states, the 50 states, because they seem to be left with the main responsibility when this thing happened?
You want me to go first?
Yeah, sure. If you want to, you can always tag Jonathan. That's fair to do.
I'll keep that in mind. But I'll grab this one first. I mean, so I think that, there's an important cautionary note in criticizing state responses, and that is that there was only so much they could do. Because the national response was so slow and the early messages were so mixed about what was going to happen, by the time it was clear that states needed to take the lead, they were in a very difficult position. And in particular, the elimination of the virus strategy that worked in places like New Zealand, I think, was almost off the table by with the numbers that states were facing by the time it was clear that this was their job. So I think, when you think about that as the background, then figuring out sort of how to critique the states, comes to this question of, well, if we're looking at sort of structures of governance and government performance, with that as the problem they were trying to solve, what types of, sort of shortcomings could we critique them for, and what kinds of shortcomings are just, this is what the hand they were dealt, and this is a bad and tricky situation. And so, I would sort of divide that into two types of possible dysfunction that would be worrisome, even in light of being dealt a difficult hand. One is what we might think of as a sort of gross policy failure. Basically choosing really bad solutions that lead to really bad and avoidable outcomes when other outcomes and options were on the table. And we might put into that group things like, President Trump's early comments that the virus was under control when that was not true, or efforts in some states to ban or preempt mask mandates at the height of the virus's spread, right? So, emergencies like a pandemic do require a willingness and capacity to govern. And when individuals and some state leaders were opposed to doing that, I think that falls into the sort of category of policy failure. The other type of dysfunction we should think about, and one that's closer to my own research, is behavior that was anti-democratic. So it's notable that not all of the policy failures that I just alluded to were necessarily driven by popular will. That is, in some cases, there was public support for government intervention, but it was government actors that undermined it. And one example of that might come from Wisconsin, where the safer at home order that the legislature intervened to try to strike down in court was actually extremely popular at the time that they took that step. So these things were not problems in every state. I think there were states that did reasonably well under the circumstances, but those are the two types of problems that I think are especially worrisome. And I think that they actually map on to what Jonathan mentioned about polarization. So maybe you'll have more to add about that.
Yeah, Jonathan, some thoughts about the states, sort of internal maybe, to in the absence of federal guidance. As Miriam says, she points out two failures, just blatant policy failures. And then what's interesting is kind of failures of democratic either representation or actually anti-democratic actions, right? Popular actions that are resisted by state leaders.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a really good answer to this question would eventually involve the kind of analysis in which we had some outcome variable that we really believed was the right one, whether it's excess mortality or deaths per capita, and we really thought we could control for all of the, for population density and weather. And the really big one that I just don't know if we're ever going to be able to get right is the different variants that have emerged at different times. And I think that so much of the cross-state variation is going to turn out to be driven by stuff like that, rather than by state policy choices. And so I think we just have to be really careful, because I think we're going to see a lot of studies to that effect that will be all politicized, and people will be trying to tell you different kinds of stories with these studies. And I think we should be very skeptical about them. But at the same time, I agree that we can drill down and start to learn some things about what has worked and what hasn't in some of the states. And I guess where I would start is just kind of back to this broad question about just the costs and benefits of federalism and multi-layered systems. one of the real costs is that is just a basic cost of trying to figure out how to make governments responsive to citizens and how to get them to do hard things, politically costly, potentially politically costly things when they're in the public interest. That's just a basic problem in democracy. And I think federalism can make that problem harder by dividing sovereignty and dividing authority in ways that make politicians able to escape hard things. And so public health is an area where you plausibly can say the federal government is responsible for certain things. You could plausibly say the states are responsible, and really the county, county officials. Here in Santa Clara County, everybody knows our county health commissioner. She is probably the most well-known official in the area for all of us. And so there is a desire. It's just easy, when you're being told when the right thing to do is politically extremely painful. It involves telling people they can't open up their business, they can't make a living. And it's unclear whether some other level of government that might be responsible for providing them some relief is ever going to provide that relief. So there's this division between those who have to do the easy things like write checks and go to press conferences, and those who have to do the hard things like actually shutting things down and forcing people to do things they don't want to do. There's this terrible mismatch where it's very tempting if you can get away with doing the easy and kind of popular stuff and making other people do the hard stuff, then that's just the politically rational thing to do for an elected official. And so there's just so much blame shifting and so much pushing of responsibility around in the system. And the thing that you would like to see in terms of accountability in a democracy, where someone makes a hard decision and then they say, well, let the voters judge me 4 years from now on the decision I've made based on my competence in doing this thing. That is something that really can be undermined by federalism, and it was in this instance. And I think India is suffering from something very similar right now. And then when you just think about that, just a basic problem, and then when you add polarization to that, you add to that a lot of voters who believe that the out party is from Satan, and that they and if they win, it's the end of the republic, it's the end of life as we know it. Then you can't very well punish at the state level or at the federal level bad performance from the in party, because that will just lead to the takeover of the out party, which it will is the end of the world. So it really makes it hard for us to achieve good governance in that setting. This combination of the blame shifting problem and this kind of negative affective polarization that we've fallen prey to, it really is a bad combination. It leads to some bad outcomes, and I think we saw lots of those during the pandemic.
Yeah, let me follow up on that, Jonathan, which is what I write about local governments, and part of federalism. We often talk about states and state differences and state relationships to the national government. But of course, there's the third tier of government, which is local government. You mentioned county health boards, but they're cities, counties, townships, all these folks who are on the front lines of the COVID response. We did see a significant amount of disagreement within states, and this goes back to Miriam, your point about say democratic failure, but it also goes to Jonathan, your point about accountability in a way, which is what explained, or can we talk a little bit about the disagreement between, say, governors and mayors, for example? And this starts to get us into these questions about why are we seeing that kind of disagreement? What is it about the polarization that you mentioned that is driving that kind of geographical, say, difference between, say, their states and their cities? What are the democratic, so maybe Miriam, you can talk a little bit more about the democratic failures you might have seen in states that you've also written about in other settings. I'd love to talk about internal to the states, what you see going on. And Miriam, if you want to start, that's great.
Sure. I mean, I actually think that we're at a moment when one of the questions, for legal scholars is what can be done about those conflicts. So I'm happy to talk about that, but I don't know if Jonathan, you want to talk more about like the why question. That seems like a bit more up your alley. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about some of the sort of the pending efforts to rethink how we allocate power.
Yeah, Jonathan, you want to say, so maybe we get into why cities lose, if we like to jump to that. In terms of this question, again, what I'm thinking about are governors overriding mayors in lots of these instances. There seems to be certainly, and I've written about this myself, a preemption epidemic along with the pandemic.
Yes, I mean, we can talk a bit about the roots of the preemption pandemic, and then we'll talk about how that worked in the pandemic. And then I'd really love to hear Miriam's thoughts on the legal aspects of this and where it's all going next.
Yeah, great.
I think that, so just in general, I think that we have, I think everyone probably knows by now that the correlation between population density and democratic voting is very high, and it's been increasing over time. It's one of the most kind of striking scatter plots you could see in the social sciences. Not the kind of thing you see very often. Like the correlation between density and democratic voting is very close to 1. And so given that background and the fact that we have this urban-rural basis to our politics and so many things, so many different issue dimensions on which people's preferences are also correlated with population density, have been activated and they've been snapped onto this two-party conflict. I think that was the kind of starting point before the pandemic. And so that has meant that the voters for parties of the left end up highly concentrated in urban districts in ways that make it, combined with gerrymandering, make it hard for them to get representation in legislatures. They do much better in statewide races. So we have a bunch of places like Pennsylvania, now Georgia, Michigan, some other states in the Midwest where Democrats routinely are able to win statewide races, like gubernatorial elections. Wisconsin's another example, but they really have no hope of winning the state legislature. So there's this kind of built-in kind of urban-based, kind of responsive to urban interests statewide officials. And then we have legislatures, which are very much more driven by the interests of ex-urban and rural voters, and they're in the hands of Republican representatives. So that's just a conflict that's sort of built in many of these states. That's kind of the background already for these battles over preemption. So in a lot of these states, there's been an effort by the state legislatures, and in some cases governors, to limit the authority of Democrat-leaning cities. And certainly this is one of the big issues in Texas politics right now. So that was kind of the background before the virus came along. And then it initially came along in these very urban, it hit first in these places like New Orleans, Detroit, New York, and Seattle. And so it seemed like an urban problem. It seemed like another thing that we could just map onto that urban-rural kind of set of issues. And that kind of started us down the path of politicization of the virus. I mean, it was, things like masks and social distancing were just politicized in a way that is really foreign to lots of other countries. Just didn't happen that way. And that's still an important question to try to understand. Well, how did that happen? And I think a part of it has to do with the initial geography of the virus. I mean, maybe it would have happened anyway if the virus had started somewhere else, but it seems important that initially it was possible for Republicans to just sort of see it as an urban problem, just like crime or homelessness or public transportation, so other sets of things that that we don't really need to worry about. And so that kind of created this initial, it fed into this kind of divide, and then you have this natural kind of built-in division between the governors in some of these states and the legislature, and it led to these intense battles in places like Michigan, where the governor was doing battle with the state legislature in similar ways in Wisconsin. So that's kind of the background, and that's how we end up with these battles. We could say more as we go about the preemption stuff specifically, but I think that's a good place for Miriam to take over.
Yeah, Miriam, you want to take the baton?
Yeah,
that's great.
I'm happy to take the baton. So, I mean, one caveat at the beginning is that because, as Jonathan says, these are at bottom political conflicts, legal changes can't be a complete answer, right? It's not the law that's causing people to sort of conflict in this way, and it's not the law that's going to, completely eliminate these types of conflicts. But I do think that there are ways that laws can be sort of productive and helpful, and also not make things worse. So let me offer sort of two types of legal interventions, one from my own work and then one that's more forward-looking. So one type of legal problem that arose during the pandemic is a series of doctrines that state courts in some states were adopting that give kind of pride of place to the state legislature. They view the legislature as kind of the pinnacle of American democracy or in-state democracy, and in various ways they prioritize legislative decisions over decisions made by other entities, whether those be local entities, executive branch entities, or the governor themselves. And one thing that I'm happy to talk more about, but that I've written about in the paper that you alluded to at the beginning, Rich, is that these doctrines are often sort of ill-footed if the idea is that they are advancing democracy within the states. And the reason for that is that state legislatures, because of the makeup that Jonathan's work so well describes, are often not the state's most majoritarian or democratic branch. They suffer from some of these pitfalls of what happens when you put single member districts and winner-take-all elections together in a system of our sort of density divide. And so one thing that state courts could do as an initial sort of not making things worse effort is not continue to indulge in legal fictions that give sort of undue or outsized sway to state legislatures, at least not under the idea that these are advancing democracy, because often they are not doing that. The other type of kind of, I think, timely legal conversation that's taking place right now is about what to do with some of these pandemic or emergency related statutes going forward. And there's, I think, a range of workable options, at least, absent sort of deadlocked polarization that could be just fine. One, I think, founding principle is that there needs to be a discretion, both at the local level and then especially at the state executive level, to handle the unknowns that emergencies bring. But to mitigate concerns about sort of unbounded discretion, there is certainly room for legislatures to provide guidance in advance, using the virtues that legislatures are supposed to bring to the table, which is, a deliberative decision-making process that incorporates a wide range of views and looks back at the experience we've just had. Professor Lindsay Wiley has done, I think, really valuable work mapping out what different kinds of reforms could look like. But something to be wary of is sort of reactive statutes that are pending now in a lot of states, I think enacted in some states, that would really substantially curtail emergency powers to the point that only the legislature could be the one to respond in the future. And that would seem to be a counterproductive measure that would, basically impede an effective response going forward. And that seems to be something that's rooted, again, in sort of negative partisanship more than any sort of evidence-based or public health outlook.
Yeah. Could you both say just a little bit more about the electoral system entrenching, say, non-majority or some form of non-majoritarian democracy in the states? Because I think we want to be clear about what's doing the work. So maybe Miriam, just say a little bit more about winner-take-all single-member districts, and then I'll turn to Jonathan. Both of you have written about this. I'll then turn to Jonathan and talk maybe some about the history, the deeper history of this, because I think you trace it back, Jonathan, all the way to industrialization in the early part of the 20th century. And I just would love to hear a little bit more about that. But maybe, Miriam, you could explain to a lay audience what exactly is doing the work here that might lead to, say, overrepresentation of one party over another and underrepresentation of, say, the cities, for example.
Sure. I mean, in my work, I draw a lot on Jonathan's actually, so I'll let him fill in any details that I omit. But I think, the basic principle for a lay audience is just that when you have intense geographic clustering, right? So if you imagine putting a grid down over a state and you have one party that's like highly concentrated in just a few squares in the grid, but every square in the grid is going to get representation, then the urban areas in particular will be underrepresented and the rural areas will be more represented. Now, that might not itself lead to any sort of partisan skew, but for the fact that also we have a partisan division, right? Whereas Jonathan said the density correlation is extremely high, so that it's mostly Democrats in cities who are concentrated in cities, and Republicans are sort of better spread out. So I think that's sort of the basic platform, upon which we get this sort of what I've described as minoritarian representation in legislatures. But this is really Jonathan's, Why Cities Lose talks a lot about this, so maybe he can add on to that.
Yeah, Jonathan, you want to say more about that and how that you've done some really good comparative work with European or at least continental electoral systems. What did you find in that research?
Yeah, just to take things a little further in understanding the U.S. case, and then I'll talk a bit more about the comparative stuff. When we have this really high correlation between density and voting behavior, it doesn't necessarily itself. Like if you imagine that there are a couple of cities that are very dense and very democratic, and say that's 50% of the population, and the other 50% is very Republican, and they're in rural areas, and you have half of the districts are Democratic and half are Republican, and maybe there's some suburban district in the middle that's kind of a swing district. That arrangement wouldn't necessarily produce bias. What it happens, and I think this is where it kind of gets interesting, because there's so much heterogeneity across states, it's not the same thing everywhere. We have a hierarchy of city sizes that just kind of emerges naturally. We see this everywhere in the world. But we have these big mega cities where it's just impossible to draw a congressional district that is not 70 or 80% Democratic. But then you might think, okay, well, fine, the rural areas are very Republican. They're probably going to be 70 or 80% Republican. And that latter thing is not the case. And that kind of becomes interesting. So why is it that the districts that the Republicans tend to win, they tend to win with much smaller majorities? And again, the answer actually has to do with cities. It has to do with a lot of smaller cities. So that there are all these places that are out along the old 19th century railroad tracks that are still have minorities. They have poor voters. That people who live in rental housing in the kind of and public employees and teachers and others who live in the city centers of these smaller cities, who also vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. And so a lot of what we think of as rural districts are actually fairly heterogeneous but lean Republican. And then of course the suburban districts and ex-urban districts can have some similar qualities. So we just don't have any of these. We don't have anything that there are a few exceptions like in rural Texas, but in most of the country we don't have places that aggregate to the size of a district that are nearly as Democratic as they're nearly as Republican as the urban Democratic districts are Democratic. Now, this is the argument I've been kind of developing for a while, but the problem in the US is everyone says, no, that can't be, it's all gerrymandering. And of course, a lot of the story is gerrymandering. There are many ways to draw the districts, and you can draw them in ways that come pretty close to being 50-50, or you can draw them in ways that are overwhelmingly unfair. And that is absolutely true. And so what we've done to try to disentangle that is develop some techniques for drawing automated districting plans that kind of mimic what an independent districts and boundaries commission on the British model might look like. And when we do that, we still find that in a lot of states, there would be bias against the Democrats because of this geography problem. But then we can also see, and this is where all of this has come to be used in the courts, we can show with a distribution of alternative plans, of simulated plans, we can show that an enacted plan is outside of that distribution, and that can show the court that can be understood as a partisan gerrymander rather than an outgrowth of geography. So these two things kind of work together to create this problem for the Democrats, which is underrepresentation relative to their vote share. And part of the story, one of the ways that we can kind of know that there's a story here about geography that's not just gerrymandering is we can look at these places like the UK and Australia and Canada, where there are independent districts and boundaries commissions, and we see the same thing over the course of the post-war period. We see an underrepresentation of labor parties and parties of the left that have these concentrations in cities, and they win massive majorities in city centers and can't manage to structure themselves in a way as to win the pivotal suburban district that they need to win in order to form a government. So it's a basic problem of winner-take-all single-member districts.
Yeah, Miriam, you've written a bit about what kind of institutional changes you want to see in the states. Do you want to say more about that? That is, I think, so Jonathan, you've said, well, proportional representation would fix some of this problem, but I don't anticipate that we'll get proportional representation in the states or certainly not in the national government anytime soon. Are there other things short of that to correct some of these imbalances?
Yeah, so first, thanks to Jonathan for that, I think, terrific explainer. One extra piece of the puzzle to mention about this feature of potentially not majoritarian legislatures at the state level is that at the national level, we might just sort of throw up our hands and say, like, okay, well, the legislature isn't perfectly representative, but like none of the federal branches are. We have an electoral college and we have courts who are appointed by the president and the Senate and then serve with life tenure. And so, what business do we have sort of ganging up on Congress for not being perfectly majoritarian? That's just not the feature of the federal constitutional government. But I think we can say something different, very different at the state level for two reasons. One is that as Jessica Bowman-Posen and I argue in a recent article that's called The Democracy Principle in State Constitutions actually are committed to majoritarian democracy, which we think of as rooted in the pillars of majority rule, popular sovereignty, and political equality. And state constitutions espouse this expressly, repeatedly, overtly, in ways that the federal constitution doesn't. If you haven't read your state constitution lately, I recommend it. They talk all about protecting the right to vote, establishing the right to vote. They talk about the power that is held by the people. They elect a whole mess of officials that the federal government does not, and they structure elections for the most part, aside from the legislature, directly without an electoral college, without the equivalent of the US Senate. So at the state level, there really is space for majoritarian influence in a way that is almost exclusive to the state level. Like, this is where we're going to get that type of governance. And in the other two branches, particularly the executive branch and also to some extent in state courts, we have opportunities for that. So that's kind of the backdrop to my answer to what sort of institutional change might be fruitful, because I think it's important to keep in mind that efforts at reform, I think, ought to be cognizant of the fact that in any sort of constitutional system, there needs to be some space for majority rule. And in our American constitutionalism, the most promising space for that, both legally and feasibly, as a matter of practicality, is often going to be at the state level. So what could we do? Well, you mentioned one thing, and Jonathan's written about this as well. So one thing we could do is that we could change the way that we select state officials. I think your sort of practical skepticism is well-founded, but on the other hand, unlike at the federal constitution, where some of these structures are constitutionally ingrained and very, very difficult to change, it is possible to change how things are done at the state level. There is a possibility of ranked choice voting in multi-member districts. And if the state constitution would need to be amended to allow that, state constitutions are typically easier to amend than the federal constitution is. So I don't think that we should give up on the possibility of structural change. I think that needs to be something that remains part of the conversation. The second sort of suite of changes that I proposed in my counter-majoritarian legislatures article is doctrinal. And again, I've mentioned this before, but rethinking some of the doctrines that give pride of place to the state legislature, at least if those are based on some theory of democracy, they really ought to be dialed back, because that is not, as Jonathan explained, that is not sort of the defining feature of state legislatures today. And then the final institutional reform that I would put on the table, and this might seem kind of silly, but bear with me, is that I think that we actually we need to change legal culture, and we need to change it to a point, to the point that state level democracy can be on the minds of the public and of scholars as much as federal level democracy is. A lot of people, like David Schleicher, have pointed out that people often don't know that much about their state officials or their state institutions. And as I have written elsewhere, the bulk of our legal discourse, what we teach in law schools, what we talk about in academic publications, the organizing, the litigation, is really focused on national level legal issues. I think that's a problem because law and democracy aren't self-executing, right? The force of the law is going to be limited to the things that people are willing to pay attention to take up, to talk about, to advocate for, and exert pressure over. And so, although it sounds maybe a little bit corny, like turning our collective attention to state public law can be a pro-democratic act unto itself, because we're only going to protect the institutions that we pay attention to and understand. So those are some thoughts on types of changes we could make.
Yeah, thank you. And it goes back to this question of if we're waiting around all the time for the federal government to respond, we're not actually, that's quite a deep weakness of a federal system. That's right. You need to actually be able to understand what's going on in your states and localities to understand who's doing what. This goes, I want to take a few questions from the audience, but this goes to a question about the ambiguity of that, and Jonathan, you mentioned this a little bit, the ambiguity that comes with, say, national funding that runs through states that then is distributed by states, and who's in charge. Is there a better way to do this so that folks, and this goes to your point, Miriam, again, so that folks know who's responsible for what? And this was quite clear in the pandemic, like who's responsible for distributing funds or distributing vaccines or distributing safety equipment, and then who does it? And a related question is, would you want to have a very powerful central government to do some of this and dictate, right? As a matter of accountability, you might be able to dictate what's happening, or is that, so sort of two questions here. One is, how do we fix that accountability problem when there's such a mixture of responsibilities? And two, if the federal government could have just sort of dictated stuff, would that have been better? And I'll let Jonathan go answer those hard questions.
Well, I think the answer to the federal government dictating policy during the pandemic, if it would have been better, I think the answer is probably no.
Probably not.
The other, but like, how do we disentangle and create accountability? I hate to say it, but I think the rest of the world looks to the U.S. as a system that does this better than, I can't tell you, so we should try to be more like Germany or Australia, where I think the federal system is even more intertwined and sort of opaque and difficult for people to follow. Not to mention Brazil and places like Argentina. We actually have a stronger link between taxes and benefits and policies. It's a little bit clearer in the U.S. than it is elsewhere. We get these local tax bills that are pretty clear, which entity, we have mosquito abatement districts, and we pay them some amount of money, and we expect them to deal with the mosquitoes. It's a bit more, it's a bit clearer in the U.S. than it is in other places, and I think you're right, though, to point out that it's still a great. It's a mess for accountability in the U.S. as well, and I don't have any brilliant ideas about how to improve that in the medium term or the long term. I just wanted to, just on the previous question about electoral reform, I just wanted to point out that I just gave my last lecture of the quarter this morning to my students, and I did one of those Zoom polls about. Well, there was one, the first question to my students was, can American democracy survive without reform? And 60% of my freshman Stanford students said no, which was a little bit worrisome. And then went on to ask, well, what kind of reform would you recommend? And I think 80% of them are in favor of proportional representation. And I did a survey at the beginning of the course where before they even learned I didn't even know if they knew what proportional representation was, and maybe they didn't. But in the initial survey, it was something like 68% that were in favor. So the next generation is ready for something different. They really hate the two-party system. They truly do. And so I'm not, I'm a realist. I don't think we're going to be adopting PR in my lifetime, but I completely agree with Miriam's idea that this is another one of these areas in which federalism can provide us with some hope. and certainly there have been, there is the ranked choice voting thing is really happening in a variety of places, and there is no reason why one of these West Coast states, say, couldn't just put PR on a statewide referendum and implement something like the German or New Zealand style upper tier mixed member system. I mean, this could be a reality pretty quickly if people wanted it to be. So I wouldn't give up on that, but I think the states and in the localities, municipalities are the place to start.
Yeah, this gets us back to the polarization point, I think, and these are, and back to the pandemic, obviously. If polarization is the problem, can we reduce that? And then would you expect better policy responses, right, from in light of a public health crisis? So these are institutional fixes, right, that you're both talking about? And this might circle us back to the opening question. Would you expect then, let's say these institutional fixes were to come into play, would you expect those to either reduce polarization? I guess you would, but correct me if I'm wrong. And then back to what we started with, would we have a better public health response to a global crisis? Would those institutional fixes have done that? Or is it really some substantive values disagreements that really swamp all of this stuff? What do you think?
Well, I think that's a great question. I just want to, and Miriam is in New Zealand, so maybe she can say something about
right.
But
Say something about New Zealand.
My intuition is that I mean, we look. This is not New Zealand, but Australia.
Yeah.
It has many of the features that we've been complaining about with U.S. federalism. This kind of intertwined authority, this ability to blame the other, 3 different levels where everybody can blame everyone. And that just isn't what happened in Australia. And my understanding is that the response was very effective in spite of a very robust federal system, where there was just a lot of collaboration and cooperation very early in the pandemic. There was a kind of intergovernmental body that was put together that was really high functioning, and people worked across party lines toward a successful solution. And I mean, New Zealand had a single party labor government that was less of that kind of cooperation was needed. But I can't help but believe that the lower level of polarization in Australia associated with, and here I'm really, this, I don't have strong evidence for this, but compulsory voting and ranked choice voting and just there's just enough that I think is institutionally different, but maybe it's just a lack of the same American, not having a civil war and a racial cleavage and all the things that we have in the U.S. I mean, it's hard to know the answer to this, but it does seem like a less polarized party system facilitated better pandemic response. That is, I feel like that intuition is strong, and I think that we might see that if we ever come to believe in a cross-country analysis of this kind, that sort of thing, that the polarization will turn out to be an important variable. But Miriam, I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, all of that seems generally right to me. So, going back a question on the accountability dilemmas that federalism yields, to some extent, those are unavoidable. But I do think that, one lesson sort of gleaned from New Zealand, although, in a somewhat different context without a federalist system, but, really good communication, particularly national level, consistent, clear communication, I think can at least mitigate some of the accountability dilemmas. So sort of national government is going to be handling these things because this is what we do best, and we're going to leave to the states these other tasks because that's what they do best. I mean, that kind of simple communication, I think, could have been helpful and would be helpful going forward. On the effect of polarization, I mean, definitely. Like, I'm not here to resolve polarization or eliminate it, obviously, but to the extent that institutional changes would mitigate it, including by discouraging or making it more difficult for extreme views to be the prevailing views in office or things like that, that would, I think, very likely help. In New Zealand, at least in the early days, many of the features of the pandemic response were not politicized, at least not in the way that we think of that in the US, right? The opposition party, in fact, was quite supportive of the prime minister's decision-making in the early days. And there were statements made like, well, people's lives are at risk, so we're all going to come together on this. in ways that I think it's actually hard to imagine having happened in the US in quite the same way. Now there is pushback, there is an opposition party, there are multiple parties, that's obviously part of the system, but I do think that changes that could be made to reduce polarization would be very likely to at least take out of the sort of negative partisanship realm things that don't need to be there, right? Things that only become politicized because this sort of ecosystem forces them to map onto people's pre-existing us versus them mentality. And getting out of that to the extent possible, I think would be a real step forward.
So very quickly, two other comments. One is a comment about the tradition of the weak executive in states, which I think is interesting. Miriam, you could just talk about it very quickly. And then a skepticism, another comment, a skepticism about the possibilities for state reform, considering that states dominated by Republicans in particular are perfectly willing to sort of dispense with those, with whatever reforms that there would be. Do you have any just real quick comments? Because then we'll get some final thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to say a quick word on each of those. So on the tradition of the weak executive in the states, that is sort of that was the founding era system in American governance. But as I explained in a paper that's called Gubernatorial Administration, that trend has basically been just consistently reversed over time to a point that many states now have governors that are not only powerful in their own right, but actually, if you're doing sort of comparative work, or have powers that are that exceed those of the United States president, right? They have line item veto powers, they have powers to reorganize their state governments, they have extreme power in many cases over their executive branches. And so there's all kinds of ways in which governors have actually become more powerful. And it seems to me that a lot of the pushback actually in the pandemic was a fear of the too powerful government, which is a different kind of problem and also a real problem that needs to be kept in mind. And on the possibility that reform is thwarted because the pathways to reform are sort of controlled by those who have an interest in preventing it, I think one place to really be thinking a lot about right now are the levers that are not controlled by state legislatures themselves, and those include, at least for now, the ballot initiative in the 24 or so states that have it. Those include the direct election of state Supreme Court justices, where those are directly elected, and also the election of governors. And those are sort of the pathways that remain open, even if sort of legislative entrenchment were to try to take root. Although those are too under attack right now in various proposals across the states.
Yeah, great. So we only have a few minutes left, so I want both of you, Jonathan and Miriam, to have the last word. So Jonathan, other thoughts that you want to leave us with, just as a kind of a conclusion, and then we'll go to Miriam, and then we'll say goodbye to everyone. But go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, I hadn't thought of any concluding thoughts. I actually had a question I wanted to pose to Miriam, but maybe I can do that later.
No, that's okay too.
What's that?
That's okay too.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, just concluding thoughts is this is really, it's just no one knows. No one knew at the beginning what the right policies were, and we still are trying to figure this out. It's going to be a long time before we can really, do the kind of analysis. I'm not sure if we'll ever really be able to do the kind of analysis we want to do, where we have a really clear connection between choices made by politicians and death rates and so forth. So we need to be modest in our aspirations of trying to understand that. So I think this kind of case-based analysis though of what clearly didn't work and also trying to find some examples of what did. I think there's still a lot of value in that, and I think we'll still learn a lot in the months ahead, but we need to also be very humble, I think, in the claims we make, and very tentative in the claims we make. But I just one of the thing that I would love to hear more of from Miriam, when she talks about the pride of place of state legislatures and the way that because it's something I've also been paying attention to, especially in the area of election law. Is this something that you see as just like a heartfelt, a constitutional theory of some kind, or is this strategic? Is this just sort of a set of actors who believe that their interests are best served by legislative dominance? And when you point to the role of, I'm just very interested in this idea of state Supreme Courts as part of the solution, because certainly we're seeing a lot more lawsuits that are kind of looking to the states rather than the federal government in this area. I think political scientists, we've always, for a long time, I think we've looked at the idea of the elected judiciary as something that is just a minefield. So many things that can go wrong, and they're just kind of nutty about electing your judges. And people in other countries are like, you elect your judges? Wait, what? But you're kind of giving us this sense that, well, there actually could be a real advantage to doing so. I mean, certainly, if you didn't have an elected state Supreme Court, I don't believe you would have ever had the districting plan thrown out in Pennsylvania. There are a variety of things related to that. So I just think it'd be great to hear your final thoughts on this idea of state Supreme Courts as a part of the solution to this.
Yeah, so I'll try to speak quickly because I know we're just about out of time. So in response to Jonathan's great questions, I would say that sure, I mean, there's a long-standing skepticism of electing judges, and there are lots of really good reasons for that. But at times when sort of democratic energy is scarce and where there are limited levers for sort of the people to exert a popular will, I think that we shouldn't write off state Supreme Courts as one sort of potential site for that. And on whether these sort of invocations of state legislative priority are sort of sincere and genuine or heartfelt or strategic, I'm sure that that varies across states, but I don't think that the legal answer turns on that, right? I think we can correct doctrines whether they are being raised in good faith or as more of a rhetorical flourish. And my closing remarks are really short. I would just say that all of this sort of experience in the past year and change has led us to be reminded that states matter, right? State governance is going to make a difference in a lot of people's lives, and one step that we can take today is to just pay more attention to what they're doing and to take that up as one of the things we pay attention to on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's a great way to end, Miriam. And so we will leave it at that. Thank you. So join me in thanking Miriam Seifter and Jonathan Rodden. This was incredible to have the two of you together and having these conversations and talking to each other. I learned a ton and hope we can do it again. But for now, that's it from the Miller Center, the virtual Miller Center. One day, very soon, I think, we'll be in person. And I hope to see you soon at the next event. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.